Hello Tower Gaming players, this is Evan Jarvis, also known as Gripst, and welcome to part 2 of my multi-table tournament guide. In this section I will cover the early stages of a tournament. First I'll go over the 4 goals you should focus on during the beginning of a tournament. I will then move on to what situations to look for to aid you in your quest of getting first place. Finally, I will teach you when you should be looking to fast play your hands and what requirements must be met to create a good situation for slow playing. If you want to give yourself the best chance to win the tournament, you should begin by eliminating all distractions. This means turning off the TV, turning off your MSN or whatever messenger program you use, and keeping yourself away from Facebook, MySpace, or whatever other pages you would typically fill the time between hands with. I'm not saying that it's forbidden to engage in any of these activities while playing a tournament, but if you want to maximize your odds of winning, you must maintain focus on the table even when you are not involved in a hand. Your first goal is to find the fish. The easiest way to do this is to take advantage of some resources that are available online. There are free websites out there that track tournament results and can provide you with valuable information as to who is a winning player at your table, who is dead money, and even who was satellited into the tournament. My favorite site to use is officialpokerrankings.com, and a couple of other great alternatives are SharkScopes and the PokerDB. If you Google them up, you should be able to find them pretty easily. Whether you look up your opponents or not is up to you. It's not the only way to find the fish. It's been said that to know someone is a good player requires a ton of hands. However, it only takes one major mistake for someone to identify themselves as a fish, so keep your eyes peeled. Some examples of fishy tendencies would be limping a lot, opening for 4, 5, or 6 times the big blind, calling raises with trouble hands, calling down big bets with weak holdings, taking ridiculous lines with bluffs that nobody would ever take with a real hand, and playing a passive game in general. These are just a few examples to get you started, but there are many more to look for. The big thing to note is that it's usually at Showdown you will be able to identify if someone has played a hand poorly, so it's important to follow the actions throughout the hand so you can make a good judgment about your opponent's play. You don't need to be involved in a hand to get information, but the information you gain from paying attention will be very useful later on. Try to acquire as much free information as possible and take detailed notes when someone does something very strange. Odds are it won't be the only time they make this type of play in the tournament. The next goal is simply to wait for your spots. Tournament poker, like all other forms of poker, is about patience. So even though it's not the most glamorous thing to do, you're going to have to do a lot of folding while waiting for a good spot to present itself. It's very easy to get bored and decide to play a marginal hand just so that you can be involved in the action. But if you're watching your table and taking lots of notes, you should be plenty involved even when you're doing nothing but folding. It's important to overcome the temptation to get involved in a marginal spot. What starts out with over-limping or calling a raise with a trouble hand can often lead to you flopping something that looks good, but in fact is a second best hand, which can cost you your stack and your shot in the tournament. Stay patient and wait for a good spot. If a good spot presents itself, you're obviously going to want to take advantage of it. But if nothing happens in the first 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or even the first hour, don't worry. There's still plenty of tournament left and your spot will come. The third goal is to go for max value when a spot comes up. If you've been paying attention to your opponents, you should know where they make their mistakes. Are they too aggressive? Do they call down with top pair no kicker? Will they always bluff with their missed draws? And so on. If you combine this information with your hand, whether it's a value hand, one that we can bet and expect to get called by worse, or a bluff catcher, a hand that can't bet for value but that we can check and call with a lot, as a lot of weaker hands will bet when checked to. It is important to know the best way to get value from our hands, as we won't be getting a ton of hands in most tournaments, so we have to make the most of each opportunity. You will also have to look beyond the current betting round. Think about how the river will play out if you bet the turn versus checking it. Are you willing to play a big pot, or are you looking to play a small one? The earlier in the hand you start thinking about these things, the more likely you'll be able to control the outcome of the hand, be it winning a big pot, winning a small pot, losing a big pot, or losing a small pot. This is a skill that comes with practice, but as long as you are thinking about all these things, you're already way ahead of most of your opponents. Our last goal in the early stages goes with the previous ones, and that is to maintain your stack. Sometimes good spots come up along in the early levels, and we can build a big stack. Sometimes we get nothing but rags and have to blind off for the first couple of hours. This is nothing to get worried about. As the tournament progresses, our decisions become much more focused on our chip stack and our position at the table rather than our cards. The bigger our stack is, the more options will be presented to us in terms of profitable spots to get involved. Think of your stack as your one and only weapon. The bigger it is, the more power it yields, and the more likely it is to make your move successful. So it is important to keep your stack as big as possible by not wasting any chips in bad spots. If you're lucky enough to run hot early and get a big stack, well, that's wonderful, but you still better know what you're doing, as it is very easy to give a big stack away. Now that you know how to acquire information and how to factor it into your decision making, let's clear up what the difference is between a profitable spot, which we like, and a marginal situation, which we want to avoid. A profitable situation is one where we have the potential to win a big pot. I guess it's kind of obvious, so let me elaborate. When looking at a profitable situation, it is one where we are either going to win a big pot or lose a small pot. The only time we would lose a big pot is if we ran into a big cooler, also known as a setup hand, or we get the money in good and get sucked out on. This idea of having the potential to win a big pot is also known as implied odds, the expected payout if we are able to make our hand. To put ourselves in high implied odds situations, we want to try to make hands that have a ton of equity against an overpair. The dream situation in the early stages is always to have an opponent have pocket aces and have him be unable to fold them, and of course for us to hit the flop hard. A set against an overpair is about a 96.1 or a 91.6% favorite. A straight against an overpair is a 96.7% favorite. And a flush against an overpair is about a 97.2% favorite, and 68.5% if they have one of the cards that can make a higher flush. These edges are extremely large, and that is why in the early stages of a tournament you should be willing to invest a few chips, but not too many, to call someone's raise and see a flop in the hopes that you can get yourself into one of these situations. This means if we are getting at least 20 to 1 on our money, meaning our opponent has 20 times what they raised to remaining in their stack, then we can happily call with pocket pairs and small to medium suited connectors. The tighter the opponent, the better, since the tight guys are more likely to have a hand that will give us action, rather than the loose guys who will usually have rather weak hands. Also, the more opponents we have, the better, as each one of them represents someone who might pay us off if we hit our hand. The reason I included suited aces here is that if you are lucky enough to flop flush over flush, the ace-high flush has 100% equity over the lower flush. But since the odds of this happening are very low, suited aces are better for over-limping, where we are getting extremely good odds on our money, rather than calling raises, where the odds are slightly lower. And the reason we want to play small suited connectors rather than the big ones is that our opponents will usually have big cards or big pairs in their hand when they raise. The last thing we would want to do is flop two pair only to run into a set or a bigger two pair. When you flop top pair, well, top two pair with something like 7-8, it's very unlikely your opponent is sharing any cards with you, so it is very likely your hand is way good. The great thing about these hands is that if we miss the flop, we can fold having lost very little and move on to the next hand. It's much like investing in a small business. At first we only put a little bit of money into the business, but if we see some big potential, i.e. we hit our hand, then we want to throw as much money at this business as possible with the expectation of hitting a big score. Moving on from implied odds hands, we know that there are going to be times when we have an overpair or a flop top pair, a hand that we figure is best, but not if we get a ton of action. In these cases, we want to keep the pot small and go for some value, but not necessarily 3 streets of value. This means you should often check back one street, be it the flop or the turn, to guarantee that the pot doesn't get too big. Checking back doesn't allow your opponent the opportunity to check raise you, and it also only gives them 2 streets to put bets in rather than 3, which will ensure things don't get out of control. It's up to you to deduce when you have a hand that can go for big value and push the envelope, or when your hand is better for pot controlling and inducing bluffs from your opponent. A general rule is that if you have a set or better, it's fine to try to go for 3 streets of value, and if you have 1 pair, you're better off going for only 2 streets of value, and sometimes just 1. Another thing to note, the more money that went in pre-flop, the more valuable hands like top pair, top kicker, and overpairs become. While pocket aces is only 1 pair and should sometimes be played carefully, if you can get 1/3 of your stack in before the flop, there's nothing wrong with going all the way on any board. Now let's look at situations you want to avoid. As I said earlier, it's very easy for a small pre-flop mistake to compound into a big mistake that can cost you your stack, so treading carefully is of the utmost importance in tournaments. We want to avoid what are known as reverse implied odds hands, which are the opposite of the ones we looked at earlier. With these type of hands, we will either win a small pot or lose a big pot, and that's never a good thing. You should not call raises with hands like Jack King, Jack 10, King Queen, and even Ace Queen in a lot of spots, because if you flop top pair and get a lot of action, it will always be against hands that have you outkicked. If you get all in with top pair on the flop against someone who has you outkicked, you only have about a 12.7% chance of winning the hand. Ready to fold Ace Queen to an under the gun open now? I know it looks like a pretty hand and it feels hard to fold, but just think of how unhappy you'll be if you flop top pair and win a tiny pot, and then think about how angry you'll be if you flop top pair and get stacked by Ace King. If you look ahead, it makes folding hands like this much easier. There are also situations where you should be willing to fold big pocket pairs. If there is a raise and a re-raise in front of you, and both players are very tight, pocket eights are probably no good. In fact, there are many cases where even pocket queens would be a trivial fold. If you ever wondered why people think pocket jacks are the hardest hand to play in Hold'em, the reason's this. People see jacks and think it's the nuts, so they don't ever plan on folding the hand. When there's a lot of action pre-flop, your best case scenario is running into Ace King where you're a flip. However, a very good percentage of the time, you'll be looking at queens, kings, or aces where you are 4-1 underdog. Yeah, that's a 20% winning chance. So look at the action ahead of you, and before you fall in love with your hand, think about it. In some spots, deuces are profitable, and in other spots, jacks are an auto fold. Again, this will come with experience, so just always be thinking about what type of player your opponent is and what types of hands you would expect him to show up with given his betting action. Post-flop is obviously a much less clear scenario and really comes down to the player you're facing in a hand. Is he a very tight player, or is he a complete loose cannon? Against some players, you will never be folding top pair after the flop because they're just maniacs who will bet with anything. But against others, it's possible to get away from an overpair. That being said, against most players, if the betting is getting very heavy, 1 pair is not going to be the winner. You have to be on the lookout for when draws come in and know when it's time to release your hand. Anyone can get paid off in a cooler situation, but it's the big folds that professionals make that separate them from the rest of the crowd. This is where your earlier exercise of observing your opponents will really pay off, so you can accurately assess whether you're in a profitable or a marginal situation. Lastly, don't go bluffing your stack away just because you can't win a pot by checking. A lot of times it's perfectly okay to just give up and let your opponents have a pot. Unlike in cash games, you can't simply reload if a bluff doesn't work out. So if you're going to be firing bullets with nothing but air, you'd better have a damn good read on your opponent's style and be 90% sure or better that he won't be able to call you down. Bluffing is a useful part of the game, but most of the bluffing that is done is simply raising to steal the blinds and continuation betting flops. The big 3-barrel bluffs should be used very sparingly, if at all, and aren't really necessary to win a tournament. A quick, friendly reminder, don't force it. As I said on the previous slide, take your time and wait for your spots, and they'll come. In the early stages, there's no pressure from the blinds, so there's no need to get in there and play a lot of hands. If that's your style, it's okay to play a lot of hands, but you'd better be sure that you're sticking to profitable situations. Most successful tournament players play tight in the early stages and wait until later in the game to really open up. So sit tight, observe your opponents, and figure out where your chips are most likely going to come from. When the right spots present themselves, be ready to execute your game plan. Another general rule is that you shouldn't go broke with one pair. Unless a lot of money has gone in before the flop, you should be very careful when you have one pair. And this does include overpairs, even the big pocket aces. Know your opponents, and if you're up against the tight guy, be willing to fold when he is representing two pair or better. If you're extremely confident, however, that your opponent overplays his medium pairs like pocket sevens to pocket jacks, then it's okay to go all the way with the big pocket pair. If you see someone do this, make a note, because odds are you'll probably see them again in another tournament down the road, and that player note will pay off in spades. You now have a general guideline for how to play before the flop in the early stages of a tournament, so let's look at what we want to do when we actually make a hand. The following information refers to situations where you are confident that you have the best hand and are willing to get all your chips in the middle if your opponents comply. The fast play should be most familiar to you, as it is simply bet, bet, betting, raising all the way. It's a pretty basic form of poker. If we get a board that has a lot of draws on it, we want to play our hand fast. If our opponent has something that will give us action, such as an overpair or top pair, we want to get as much money in before anything comes that might scare him off. We don't want an ace or a king to come off if our opponent has a weak overpair, and we definitely don't want a flush or straight completing. So, the lower the top card on the board, the more we should be inclined to fast play to avoid overcards that might scare our opponent's weak overpair or top pair type hand. Also, the more draws out there, the more we should be inclined to fast play for the same reason, and also because we don't want cards coming in that might make our hand second best. The more opponents in the pot, the more we should fast play as well. People love to call bets on the flop since they seem very cheap, and hey, why not try to hit an inside straight on the turn, even if I'll miss 90% of the time. You want to get people to commit money early so that you can take a big pot down later in the hand. The more opponents out there, the lower your winning chances are. So you must fast play your hand to protect it and start narrowing down the field. When we are out of position, we should also be more apt to fast play, since we don't have as much control over the hand. He who has position holds a lot of the power. He has the ability to pot control, see free cards, and do all sorts of fun stuff. Without the luxury of position, we want to typically end the hand as quickly as possible. And if our opponent has a strong hand, we want to charge him the maximum, and checking out a position simply isn't going to accomplish that. Lastly, when you have a passive opponent, you need to play your hands fast. Some players just don't like to bet. They like to call and check, regardless of their hand strength. Against these type of players, it's your job to set the price and do the betting. No, you can't expect a continuation bet out of them, and no, you shouldn't expect them to fall into your wicked awesome trap. They're calling stations, and they're called calling stations for a reason, so make your bets, make them big, and I'd expect you to get a lot of calls and thus a lot of value. On to slow playing, and you'll find that the times to slow play are pretty much the opposite of the times to fast play. A dry board is one that has very few draws. Some examples are Ace 9-4, King 7-2, Jack 5-3, all rainbow of course. When there's no flush draw and your opponents are unlikely to have cards that would fill the straight, odds are whoever has the best hand on the flop will still have the best hand on the river. When you flop a monster on a dry board, it's okay to let your opponent see a free card since it's almost impossible for them to catch up to you. Don't take it too far though. You still have to build a pot, so unless your opponent is very short stacked and only has like a pot size bet left, then you probably shouldn't be slow playing for more than one street. When the pot is heads up or three-way, it's also a more appropriate time to slow play. The fewer opponents you are up against, the lower your chances of getting sucked out on. Also, it becomes less likely that someone has a hand that will give you action. But then again, never take the slow play too far, because it can definitely come back to bite you if you overdo it. Against aggressive opponents is the one time we can really slow play all the way to the end. If you're up against an opponent who never stops betting, then you shouldn't try to dissuade him from continuing to do so. You don't want to reveal the strength of your hand with an ill-timed check raise. You want to let your opponent bluff off as many chips as possible before you snap the raise on them. This is why against some opponents it is correct to check the whole way down, yes, even on the river, before springing the all-in raise on them. If they have total air, they aren't going to be able to call your raise anyway. But having total air doesn't mean they won't keep betting if you keep showing them weakness. This ties in my last consideration for slow playing, and that is when betting or raising generates no value. Sometimes, even though you have a really good hand, it's almost impossible for your opponent to have something that can give you action. Occasionally, you've got to accept that your hand is simply a bluff catcher, and the only way you will induce value is by getting your opponent to bluff at you. Don't be afraid to have a river get checked through when you hold the nuts if you think your opponent has nothing. Let me say it one more time. They can't ever call you with 7 high, but they can give you much needed value if you let them bet. You should now have a really good idea of how to play the early stages of the tournament, and by following my advice, you will always give yourself the best chance at still being around when the fun part of the tournament gets going. And if you're running very well, you'll be there with a big stack. This game is all about information, and there's no better time to start gathering information than right off the bat when people are going to be showing their true stripes. Most of this information that we've gone over is applicable when you have more than 40 big blinds. Once you drop below that, it's time to start making some adjustments. In the next lesson, I will go over the middle stages of a tournament and how to build a serious stack so that you can stay above 40 big blinds and have lots of breathing room. This has been Evan Jarvis for Tower Gaming. See you at the top.